Zionism has become a four-letter word.
Zionist.
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 Zionism.
The execution we will carry out on all Zionists.
Demons, truly, I think.
This cuts deep, because I'm a Zionist. Not in some political slogan kind of way, just in the simple sense that I believe the Jewish people have the right to live in our historic homeland. But today, that belief, that identity, gets twisted into something horrible. The hate aimed at Zionists is dark, it's personal, and it's directed almost exclusively at Jews. So let's break it down. How did the term Zionist become a slur? Millions of Jews around the world call themselves Zionists. They believe in Zionism's simple principle that Jews deserve a homeland. For some, it's a matter of faith. For others, it's politics. And for many Jews, it's history. The land of Israel is where we became a people. But today, it feels like it's safer to hide that, because online and in classrooms, and even in casual conversation, Zionist keeps being used like an insult.
Zionism is Islamophobia. Zionism is racism.
Why? Well, let's roll back the clock. In the late 1800s, after centuries of persecution, pogroms, and exile, Jews across Europe started dreaming of something radical, a world where Jews finally had agency. That dream became known as Zionism, named for Zion, the ancient word for Jerusalem and the land of Israel. Zionism wasn't all that different from other forms of nationalism sweeping the globe. At its core, the ideology was and is simple: the belief in self-determination in the Jewish people's ancestral homeland. So while early Zionist thinkers often disagreed on what that should look like, the end result was always the same: safety and dignity. By the early 1900s, the movement had gained serious momentum, especially in Tsarist Russia. But soon it collided with another global movement that changed everything: communism. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they already distrusted Zionism. Communism preached a global revolution. Zionism was about one people in one land, a distraction from the only fight that mattered: the class struggle. The communists shut down all forms of religious expression, but they insisted that anti-Semitism was a disease of the old Tsarist regime, a tool to manipulate and distract the working class from the greedy landowners and capitalists. So they banned any expression of Jew hatred. Except this was a fantasy. Obviously, you can't erase centuries of hate with the stroke of a pen. And when Israel's new ambassador to the USSR visited Moscow in 1948, tens of thousands of Jews lined up to greet her. The sense of connection that the Jews of Moscow felt with Golda Meir didn't go unnoticed by the Soviets, and it confirmed what they already had always suspected. Those weren't real Soviets, they were Jews, linked to Jews thousands of miles away. And that meant only one thing: conspiracy. A global Jewish network pulling strings everywhere. The Soviets didn't invent this conspiracy theory. It had floated around for decades. Since 1903, when a Russian journalist claimed to have discovered a secret Jewish blueprint for world domination. In reality, the protocols of the Elders of Zion were total fiction, but its falsehoods spread like wildfire. Even the Nazis had a version of this lie. But because the Soviets had portrayed themselves as the biggest enemies of fascism, they couldn't be seen parroting Third Reich propaganda. So what do you do when you hate and suspect Jewish people, but have technically outlawed anti-Semitism? You repackage your hatred of the Jew into a hatred of the Zionist. Forget just do it or share a Coke. This was one of the most successful marketing campaigns in modern history. By 1950, Zionism had been branded as nefarious and dangerous. It wasn't a Jewish liberation movement, it was a Jewish global conspiracy, a recycled anti-Semitic accusation. By using Zionist in place of Jew, the Soviets also hid behind a thin veneer of plausible deniability. They weren't expressing Jew hatred because they weren't criticizing Jews, they were criticizing Zionists. The Soviets divorced Zionism from its true meaning of Jewish self-determination, and Zionist became a cover to talk about Jewish people in a derogatory way. A phenomenon that feels like a 21st century problem, but that actually is almost a century old, not born on a college campus, but in the Kremlin. And this wasn't just rhetoric. Jews suspected of being Zionists were surveilled, harassed, denied exit visas, and sent to brutal labor camps. Even loyal communists who once defended the USSR against accusations of anti-Semitism were arrested and silenced. Tight quotas limited Jewish lawyers, diplomats, and academics. Yiddish newspapers were shut down. Jewish artists were accused of being Zionist traitors, and they were executed. And in Stalin's infamous doctor's plot, Jewish physicians were accused of murdering his inner circle, because the reality was that Jew and Zionist were a distinction without a difference. When it came to Soviet crackdowns, all Jews were targets, not just Zionists. In the 1950s, the Soviets exported this propaganda to the Arab world, flooding it with translations of the fictitious protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Arab world was already primed to equate Jews and Zionists. Most Arab leaders had opposed Zionism from its inception, viewing it as a movement that dispossessed Arabs of their land and homes. Zionism was a pain point, not anything to be celebrated. And when Israel won the Six-Day War in 1967, humiliating their Soviet-backed enemies, the USSR went global. This is Isabella Tabarovsky, a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism.
At that point, the Soviets really believed that Zionism is this massively powerful ideological enemy that's present everywhere. And because it's present everywhere, it needs to be fought everywhere. And so they launched a massive propaganda campaign in dozens of languages, directing it at dozens of countries, working through their embassies, working through the UN, working through the communist parties and their publications, which they supported and financed.
The new Soviet talking points associated Zionism with the most malevolent isms humanity could produce: racism, fascism, imperialism, colonialism. Movements that were all about power imbalances. The strong subjugating the weak. The capitalist class stealing land for its own profit at the expense of the native people. A minority appropriating absolute power over the majority. All the things that communists hated most. The Soviets promoted the idea that Israel was an apartheid regime, putting Israel in the same political black box as South Africa, the world's pariah. They linked the Palestinian struggle with the African fight against racist European imperialists. Like all national movements, Zionism's path from idea to reality had its challenges. Sometimes its expression was deeply flawed, sometimes it was hijacked by extremists. And especially in the early years of the state, Zionism experienced some serious growing pains. But the Soviet critiques of Zionism didn't stem from a noble desire to right wrongs, or create a more just society, or solve the conflict. It was about demonization, about making Zionism and Zionists, and by extension, Jews, untouchable. By equating Zionism with these toxic ideologies, the Soviets framed the Arab-Israeli conflict entirely as a racial power imbalance, with Zionism on the wrong side of the scale. This propaganda effort reached a head when the UN passed a resolution declaring that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. The resolution was eventually reversed by the UN 15 years later, but the damage was done. The concept of Zionism as a racist ideology had gone mainstream, reinforcing anti-Zionism as the only moral position.
Until 67, the left, again, the far left, communists and various socialists, they don't approve of Zionism because it's a nationalist ideology. But they argue against it in terms that, agree or disagree, they have logic to them. Starting with 67, it becomes this really strident, demonizing language where they're no longer even really engaging with the ideas. They are just trying to demonize.
Post-colonialist theory emerges in the late 1960s and basically says anything having to do with the colonialist period should be viewed in sin and needs to be disregarded.
This is Rachel Fish, a scholar of Jewish history and anti-Semitism.
That idea also then is translated into the late 1990s with post-nationalism, where now it's not that colonialism is the issue, it's that nationalism and the idea of the birth of nation states is the issue and causes all the problems in the world. So all of these ideas actually are problematic if they are taken as a primary lens, because they then suggest that Jews have no right to self-determination.
In the 100 or so years since Soviet anti-Zionism first reared its head, the meaning of Zionist and Zionism has become completely warped.
There is no palatable form of Zionism.
What is a Zionist? A white supremacist.
Zionism is a religious ethno-supremacist ideology that revolves around the exterminationist policies of removing the indigenous population that lived in, as you said, historic Palestine.
Zionism has become a zero-sum concept defined by the people who hate it. Many anti-Zionists claim that Zionism is really just Jewish supremacy, that Zionists believe Jewish people deserve more rights and better treatment than others, that Zionists refuse to see the humanity of Palestinians, that Zionists are no different than Nazis. And you wouldn't be friends with a Nazi, would you? In some spaces on the progressive left, being an anti-Zionist carries the same cachet as being an anti-racist. And any connection to Israel can get you labeled as a racist Zionist. Believing Israel should exist makes you too toxic to share a panel at a conference. Giving a talk to a Jewish women's group at an event totally irrelevant to Israel makes you a Zionist, and therefore untouchable. Asking a Zionist rabbi to moderate a book talk gets your event canceled, even if you're critical of Israel. So where's the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Because as Soviet history shows, the line is fragile, and sometimes it doesn't even exist at all. Sometimes just being Jewish disqualifies you from being accepted. Like when Jewish lesbians are kicked out of a parade for waving a pride flag with a Star of David, or when Jewish comedians have their sets canceled. Because if Zionism is toxic, then so are Jews. And the next logical conclusion is that the only good kind of Jew is the one that rejects Zionism. Why is that dangerous? Because many of the people who want Jews to reject Zionism often don't feel comfortable with Jews having power, being at the mercy of whoever was in charge. But a lot of anti-Zionist Jews today draw their anti-Zionism from opposition to the actions of the State of Israel. They believe that the way that it expresses power is immoral, that it's supremacist. And there are absolutely valid criticisms and concerns about the way Israel governs itself, or how it manages Palestinian rights and freedoms in the West Bank, or how some of its politicians talk about non-Jewish Israelis. Look, finding fault with Israel and calling it out publicly doesn't automatically make you anti-Semitic or an anti-Zionist or anti-Israel. Two things can be true at once. You can believe in the basic Zionist principle that Israel should exist as a Jewish state, and you can fight for a better, more just expression of Zionism. Many Israelis do, many Jewish people do, because Zionism is a diverse movement. It includes many people who advocate for Palestinian rights, who understand that while Zionism is fundamentally about Jews having agency, it doesn't mean it should come at the expense of non-Jews. Israel's Declaration of Independence specifically states that every inhabitant is guaranteed equal social and political rights. And being a Zionist certainly doesn't require agreeing with everything the Israeli government does. But put all these intellectual abstractions aside. The overwhelming majority of Jewish people worldwide feel connected to Israel, which means that excluding Zionists from cafes, from film festivals, from college campuses, it effectively means excluding most Jews from public life.
Nashin, when you see a sign at your campus, "No Zionists allowed," do you feel welcome at McGill?
My grandfather was born in a refugee camp outside of Yemen in the British Protectorate because Jews were being persecuted, and my grandmother was born in Morocco when Jews were being persecuted, and Israel was the only country that took them in. So when I see a sign on my campus saying "No Zionists allowed," that means no Jews allowed.
But hatred for Zionism and the use of Zionist as a slur doesn't only exist on the far left. The far right latched onto it too. They don't think that Jewish people are white supremacists, quite the contrary. They believe Jews are a threat to white supremacy. And they're not afraid to openly accuse Jewish people of plotting to dominate the world, or manipulating economies, or really any negative thing that they can think of. They don't use Zionists because they're trying to hide their Jew hatred. Instead, it's a tactic. By using Zionist or the shorthand Zio, they avoid getting deplatformed or blocked from social media. It's the other side of the coin of Soviet plausible deniability. Far-right anti-Semites frame themselves as standing up against a nefarious global movement, Zionism.
World War I and World War II were to build Israel. We know this for a fact because of the Balfour Declaration.
Zionism has brought us nothing but grief in America. Can you name one positive thing that Zionists have contributed to America?
And the thing is, even though this rhetoric has spiked from the left and the right since October 7th, it started well before. Whether it comes from avowed anti-Semites or people who say they're simply against Zionists, not Jewish people, We know what the end result is, because we've seen this play out before. When Zionism is accused of all the world's evils, Jews are too, no matter who they are or what they believe. And this is the crux of it. In a vacuum, arguing against Zionism or nationalism generally isn't necessarily hurtful to Jews. But the reality is that no one argues in a vacuum. And this is the result.
Breaking news right now, the FBI investigating a targeted terror attack in Boulder, Colorado.
And several people were injured when someone used an incendiary device on demonstrators,
setting fire to innocent people who'd been calling attention to the hostages still being held in Gaza.
I jumped over this tiny little fence, and it was two older ladies, and they had really bad burns all up on their legs. I wasn't there long enough to be able to know, and I just hope that they're okay.
I live in Denver. Friends of my friends were there, in Boulder, on that terrifying day. Lots of Jewish people are separated only by degrees from the victims of these events. We all know someone who knows someone who knows someone, but even the Jews who don't are connected to what happened. Because all Jews are impacted, even from a distance. Zionists, non-Zionists, anti-Zionists, everyone. It's become acceptable and even welcome to dehumanize, exclude, and threaten Zionists. And it's coming from the left and from the right. We don't all have to agree on Zionism, but if we want honest conversations, we have to ask, when does criticizing a movement cross into targeting a people? Because what starts with Zionists doesn't end with Zionists, and that puts all Jews in danger, regardless of what they believe.